So hello everybody, Rachel Mitchell. I am the Principal Consultant at Leadership Through Data. Leadership Through Data offer training and consultancy, and hopefully at the end of this session you will get in touch with us to find out more. So I am going to be talking to you about the practical application of records management in Microsoft 365. And I've planned to talk for about 45 minutes, so hopefully we can do questions at the end. So please add your questions in the chat, and then I'll make sure I come back to those at the end if that's okay, because I might cover some of the things that you want to ask throughout the session. I'm hoping to give you some practical examples of how my mind thinks in relation to Microsoft 365. My background, I was in public service for too many years than I care to mention, as an information governance lead and a data protection officer. But I started to roll out Microsoft 365 myself, and I kept getting told, you can't do that. Now, if anybody knows me, when I'm told I can't do something, it tends to make me think, how can I get round that? Unless it's something really dodgy, obviously. So I started to really look under the hood of Microsoft 365, and now I train Microsoft 365 records management and different bits and pieces. For those that haven't been on my presentations before, there's always a theme to try and keep us a little bit energized throughout the session. The theme this time are my 7-inch singles records. Get it? So I've tried to put a little photograph. Now you can see I took these photographs the day before yesterday on my lounge carpet. So I do own these singles. So I've put little photographs of the singles in the slides where I think they're relevant. Now, I just want to point out that the first record I ever bought is on the first slide, which was Gillen. Now, when you see the rest of my singles, you will realise that was completely kind of out of my normal curve. But this was the first record I bought with my own money in 1981. I'm not going to say how old I was. And hopefully you will see, in the same way you will see with my single collection, we will talk about classification and how that's really important with records management, and think about genre and style as we go through. Okay, let's do this then. So first thing I want to talk about is team's first approach. Now, I've previously done a session some time ago now for IRMS, which explains the team's first approach for Microsoft 365 rollout, which is groups for governance, teams for collaboration, and SharePoint for records and information management. Now you have all joined the chat, I can pop that little link in the chat for us. It's still on YouTube, and I am not going to cover the issues that I covered in that session. So if you want to go and have a little look at that one, that's still on the IRMS YouTube channel, and I'm just going to pop the link in the chat. So that talks through why I think the team's first approach is still relevant, and I still advocate that as the best approach for the majority of organizations. Not all, but the majority of organizations. So in a nutshell, 3 is the magic number. See what I did there? You can create the M365 group to govern the role-based access, the accountability, and also the responsibility. And if all of your SharePoint sites have a team associated to allow collaboration and sharing of content from the associated functional SharePoint site, we can have all the discussions in relation to that function in the channel chat of that team to avoid the overuse of email for internal communications. That's why I like it. I like to avoid email for internal communications wherever possible. And one of the things that I'd normally do if I'm doing a migration is actually find out what email-based processes we have that are internal. People are saying the sound is coming and going. Is everybody having that issue? Oh dear. Elizabeth, are you hearing me okay?
Yes, I am hearing you okay. It is breaking up a little bit, but what I would recommend is if people turn the external captions on, if you're having difficulty hearing the sound, if you turn the captions on, then you will be able to hear what Rachel's saying.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Apologies, everyone. There's nothing wrong with my signal, so I'm not sure why that's happening. So we'll carry on. So Teams first approach then. So that's what I would advocate, and have a little look at that previous presentation, which talks that through in quite some detail. Okay. The other issue that we have to deal with, which I want to do up front, and apologies for the amount of text on this slide, because I purposefully did this so that you can actually have this as a bit of a record, which users need a license. Now, I speak to organisations that are trying to do tiered approaches to licensing. You can do this, but there are some dangers. And this is the text from Microsoft, from their product terms. And I'm going to, again, put the link to those product terms into the chat. Licensing is one of the most complicated things on the platform, but it does say that any user who is benefiting from the service requires that license. And then when we look at the slide, you can see examples of users who benefit from that license condition. So it can be users with the following assigned roles, which is number one. I'm not going to read the roles, so they are records management roles within the system. It can be SharePoint site owners and members, where there is a retention policy or a retention label policy. So it's not as simple as the center gets E5 and the rest of the world get E3. So please be careful with the licensing, and you can have a look at that link that I've popped into the channel for you. Also, I have added on here a little bit of just watching the chat about the comments about the volume. Apologies, I don't know what I can do about that. I've added a little slide around the key features that are available to us in E3 versus E5. But please remember that it's like we have to live two separate lives. Got that one. So if you're on E3 versus E5, there are different capabilities available to us. And I'm just going to explain some of those in a little bit more detail. Okay. So the first thing is in relation to one of the biggies, to be honest, is the fact that we can't do reviews with E3. So if we're doing records management lifecycle, and we want reviews to happen at the end of our life cycle, we cannot do that with E3. Okay, so that's a higher risk application than E5. Other things, we can't use auto application. I'm going to talk about auto application a bit later on. That is an E5 capability. Okay. The other E5 capability is the use of the file plan within Microsoft Purview. For those that aren't familiar with Microsoft Purview, there are a number of different capabilities that we can use for records and data lifecycle management. There's a records management module which contains a file plan and also has enriched data in there in relation to being able to actually integrate our business classification. I'm going to talk a bit more about business classification. So that is only available on E5. If we have an E5 license, we can use adaptive scopes. Adaptive scopes are where well, it's kind of said, does what it says on the tin. Adaptive scopes can be used to actually adapt with certain conditions. So one of the adaptive scopes I look at in training is about applying a specific scope that is a retention on emails and OneDrives that adapts to whether you're an information asset owner or not. Okay, so if you're an information asset owner, you get a certain set of conditions. If you're not an information asset owner, you get another set of conditions. And if you move into that information asset owner group, the policy adapts to you. So it actually attracts that information asset owner capability if you become an information asset owner. So there's lots of differences between E3 and E5. I could spend the whole 45 minutes talking about that. I am not going to do that. But please use the resources that I've popped on the slides and in the chat. And it is a minefield, and I'm very sorry it's so complicated. Okay. We need to set the foundations off the box. If I say that once about working off the box when I'm doing training, I say it 325 times. That might be a slight exaggeration. We need to set the expectations of the behaviours of people and where you want records stored as records managers or information governance leads or information managers, whatever your title is. And I like to call this Together in Electric Dreams. See what I did there? I go with the Microsoft view. We're still getting that the sound quality is very bad. I'm just wondering if there's anything I can do about that, and I don't think there is. Elizabeth, are you still getting it really bad?
It is going in and out for me, but it's perfectly. I'm getting all the words, as it were.
Yeah.
I think.
Let me try a headset. Somebody's messaged that. Let me try a headset. I hate wearing a headset, but just for you, everybody, I'm going to put one on. And I don't normally have to use one, so it's a little bit odd, I'm going to be honest. I don't want to move my machine because, excuse me a second, everybody, I'm just going to put my headset in. Sorry about the recording. Okay. Is that better?
Do people think that that's better? If you can just
that's perfect. I'm glad.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Okay, no one else needs to say yes. Thank you. Okay, so I was talking about, oh, somebody said no difference. Oh my goodness. I am just going to carry on. So as I was talking about my electric dreams, I like to go with the Microsoft view that records are managed in situ. I do not ever expect people to move things. And I base that on, I don't have time actually, so why are they going to have time to do this? I just don't agree with it. This is a personal view, but it also links into the Microsoft view that actually we manage in place. So some high-level themes for setting our high-level principles. So OneDrive, I like to think of as business personal only. Business personal. Teams chat, ephemera, things like, are you going for lunch now? We are not keeping that. We put a short retention on it. Teams channels are for functional decisions, but we need to encourage people to put links, not attachments, from the relevant associated SharePoint site. SharePoint itself should be the only repository for functional information, including drafts, in my opinion. If we say people can put drafts in their OneDrive, they will forget to move them. And I like people to create where they need to store, because I think that also helps people to get into the culture of using Microsoft 365 as it was meant to be used. And I tend to tempt them to do that by putting templates on the new menus within their functional Teams and SharePoint sites. Email to be avoided, as I mentioned earlier, for internal communication. Wherever possible, use chat for ephemeral kind of conversations and use channels for functional that are linked to the functional space that we are governing in our Teams first approach. So that's the kind of high level principles I'm talking about. And also think about a bit wider: intranet, internet, line of business systems, and make sure that you are saying as an organization what you're expecting the behaviors to be in relation to each of those different areas and repositories. And I know some of you are going to have a lot of different repositories, but it really is worth making sure that it's really clear about what people should do and what they shouldn't do, because then you can pop some compliance in and you can try to sort it if people aren't complying with what you're asking. Okay, but we need to tell them first. And it always amazes me when I go into organizations how many actually don't have that laid out clearly for people from the off. Okay, so that's about our electric dreams then. So we also need to employ our brilliant minds. We're still off the box, and think about your policies or your key documents that you need to use in order to do your M365 records management appropriately. My favorite thing on the planet, a business classification scheme. It might be embedded in your IAR, it might be embedded in your ROPA, it might be embedded in your retention schedule. That's my second most important document that you will have. The third one is a security classification or protective marking policy. It may not be that you have that kind of approach in your organization at the moment, but you need to think about that from a records management perspective, because we need to identify our high risk or high value information. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later. So for me, it's really important to try and identify if we have information that needs to be protected at that slightly higher level. And even if you're not working in something like law enforcement or anything where you have protected information in that way, things like information in relation to intelligence, say, or whatever else it might be, we always have personal data. We always have people management data. So that definitely needs to have a higher protection for all the reasons that you know and I know in relation to data protection. Okay, so thinking about those key things that we have. So the business classification scheme sets the information architecture. The retention schedule sets the aspirational, and I'm using that word, retention or disposal periods. The security classification sets the data loss prevention actions. And the IAO network, oh, I forgot that one. Sorry, we need an information asset owner policy, because the IAO network becomes the accountability framework for the functional areas we're building into our information architecture. Okay, we are responsible for setting the policies. We are not responsible for making sure everyone is doing what they need to do in the business. We need to have accountable people that we can go to and say, your department isn't being compliant, when we're doing our overall checks and balances. Okay, so just to recap those then, we've said a business classification scheme, a retention schedule, maybe one and the same, a security classification or protective marking policy, and an information asset owner policy or similar. Okay, so that's our off the box stuff that we need to do, and that's in relation to our policy setting. So setting the foundations in the box. I always talk about information architecture. Information architecture is my favorite course to teach because it is the foundation of good records management. If your information architecture in Microsoft 365 is poor, your records management will be nigh on impossible. It's like having everything in email. Email is our worst nightmare as records managers because it's a mix of business classifications. And that's why a lot of organizations, we just do it on a role-based capability now, or even just a blanket capability across an organization, because it's too difficult to do it in a functional records management way or data lifecycle management way. If we have a good information architecture in Microsoft 365, this gives us the good foundation, and it defines how, as an organization, you structure, you label, and you secure your content. And a well-designed information architecture improves, as we know, findability, collaboration, and compliance. Okay, so what I like to think about is, if I get the architecture right with my team's first approach, if I tell people to actually save stuff in this place, if they're in human resources, say, I can make sure that the protection and the records management then comes to that space. They don't have to do anything else at the highest level. There might be a couple of exceptions. So information architecture for me is absolutely key. So the high level principles, this is my dear Prudence moment. Good, aren't I? Keep it simple. I know this is a bit cringy with the records, but you know, we've got to have a theme somewhere. Keep it simple. Avoid overcomplication. I was having a quick chat with Elizabeth before I came on today, and it's always a bit nerve-wracking when we've got such a lot of people on a call that want solutions about Microsoft 365, because you're going to be at all different levels of understanding and where you are in your organization. Keep it simple. Start simple. And I'm going to give you some ideas around that, some practical ways I like to think it through in a wee while. Automate where possible. That's not always easy, but actually we can get a sense of automation by using container level retention. So just going back to what I said, you store it in the right place, I will make sure that the retention is sorted for you. Okay, that feels quite automated, even though it's not using the WYSI automated tools, but I am going to talk about those. My favorite one, make governance invisible to the users. They don't want to be doing this stuff. They haven't got the time to do this stuff. Try and think about where you can hide the governance. I like to also do governance by stealth, particularly metadata collection by stealth. So that for me is how you create your templating. So if I've got templates created that have people asking for a drop-down box about which department they're in, and that actually links to my functional retention, that's nice metadata. And people seem to want to kind of do a drop-down on a template much more than they would like to apply metadata to a column. Does anybody else think that's true? People actually seem to go with templates. Thumbs up if you agree with that. Yeah. Templates seem to be a thing where they think, yeah, I'm okay with that. I don't mind filling out this form. But as soon as you say to them, stick some metadata on a column, they run for the hills. So make governance invisible to users. Design once, reuse everywhere. This is about making sure all of your templating is right for the organization. What's your baseline metadata you want? What are your baseline columns you want when anybody creates or the IT, the center, creates a team site and a SharePoint site? What's the basic metadata that your organization needs? Most organizations are still on the out of the box columns. We don't need to be. we can actually have our own organizational standard for that. So think about how we can have those baselines and those templates for our team sites, for our SharePoint sites that are created then on provisioning. Okay. The other massive one for me is accountability. And I've touched on that when I talked about information asset owners. We need people accountable for each functional area in my Microsoft 365 space. And then they are also accountable for the retention things that are going on there as well, and the records management aspects. So that's the key things, the high level principles. Keep it simple, automate where possible, make governance invisible, design once, reuse everywhere, and have accountability for each information area. Okay, and I know you're thinking, well, you haven't really told me anything practical yet. We're getting there. Practically, do not use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. When I go into an organization and I sit with them and work out initially what I think the building blocks are for their information architecture, I like to use this very little simple template that I've popped on the slide. And I know it might be a bit difficult to read for you, but I'm going to explain it. If you look at the team's first approach presentation that I talked about, I like to talk about Lego bricks when I'm in organizations, and my Lego bricks are the building blocks that I use to create the information architecture. Each Lego brick is a Microsoft 365 group, orange box on my slide. It's a team, which is the purple box on my side, and then it's a series of channels, which are the bits underneath. Okay. They will also then be associated with a SharePoint site. And as you're aware, when you add channels, you potentially get things happening in your SharePoint, which we'll talk about. Now, when I go and sit with a team, I will try to find out from them how many Lego bricks I need to create in order to cover their functional capability that they are working with within their sort of organizational team. Okay. So for example, let's think about information governance. Information governance does a variety of things. And where I used to work, so when I was the DPO at the Care Inspectorate and the IG lead there, I had freedom of information, Scotland, I had subject access, I had information governance, I had some transformation projects, etc., etc., etc. We don't just have one function or neat little box from our retention schedule that we are working on, do we, as organizational teams? We have a variety. So for me, if we think about information governance, freedom of information kind of does exactly what it says on the tin. It should be open. So actually there's no sensitivity should be associated with that. So actually that Lego brick, we could have the orange box. We would have in that orange box, it asks for the group name. So our group name could be freedom of information, FOI. The classification could be official if I'm using the government security classifications. Public or private, public, there's no reason for me to lock that down. There's no sensitivity associated with it. Make sure that decision about public or private is linked to your classification, not a user choice, because everyone will lock everything down to private. That stifles innovation, stifles findability, and really isn't how Microsoft expected us to use this environment. Okay. If there's a really good reason for us to lock something down, I am all for it. I was working in law enforcement for years and intelligence before that. So I am happy that if we need to lock it down, we need to lock it down, but let's not do it just because we can. Link that policy back to your governance policy. So public or private, what is the retention on that freedom of information Lego brick? Decide that as you create your group. It might be in your retention schedule because we are professionals and we like to make sure that we go down to the granular little levels. There might be a couple of retentions that actually apply to the FOI material in that space. This is where a digital retention level comes in, or a digital retention scheme, where we bring it to one level and we apply that to the Lego brick. Okay, so we've got our digital retention that's based in our purest retention scheme, but we've made a risk-based decision to enable us to manage it in a digital format, that we're going with one retention period for that whole Lego brick. Okay, maybe different organizations tend to have quite variety on freedom of information, actually. But whatever it is for your organization, then we can apply it at the Lego brick level. Who's the information asset owner for that Microsoft 365 group? So for me, as the information governance lead, it was actually the head of IT, the director for IT. So that's the accountability point. 2 owners minimum. And then think about actually how we then use the owners in that space to actually then become responsible. I would have provisioning still done only at the center against your template, so that we can go through this process once we've done a remediation or a migration. But also, once that's happened, the owners are responsible for everything within their group. I like them to be able to use, add people if they need to, create channels, have that freedom to work in that space. Okay. I know I've got some information about some questions about triggers and ends of projects dates. That's about a specific type of retention, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. At the moment, I am just talking about the retention period. Okay, I'm not talking about how I'm implementing it, but I'm implementing it at the top level of my Lego brick. I don't want to break that retention period as I come through the different levels. Okay, the channels then, we've got standard channels that are open to everybody within the team. We have private channels which are locked down to members of that team. And we have shared channels where you can invite somebody in from externally to the team or the organization even to join that channel to work on a specific capability or function. Okay. In this example I've got on the slide, I have used a private channel for appraisal conversations between the team leader and one of their team. So we've got the team lead and XX appraisal material. That's locked down to them. They are a member of the Freedom of Information team. Yes, that's not a purist records management approach, but you know what? It works really nicely for the users. And that's what we still need to remember. It's not always about us. Okay. The other thing I've got in there is a shared channel called Project X. I normally say Project Flip Flop for some reason. That could be if you're doing a bit of a freedom of information improvement in relation to, say, an online form with IT, and actually you just want your IT colleagues to come into that one channel to talk about that project for a period of time. Okay. Is that the end of project date trigger you were talking about? I wouldn't go granular with that. I would still use the same freedom of information that I would use for the whole site. That's my compromise. Okay. So I would just lump that in with all of the information within the freedom of information space. If that's not what you meant, Catherine, we'll come back to it at the end. I'm happy to take questions about that at the end. So please pop more in the chat, but I want to move on so I can get through all the content and then we can come back to questions. SharePoint's modern architecture is flat, as you know, and it's not hierarchical, but you can still rise to the occasion. And we can use hubs to give users a comfort in hierarchies. It's about the users, remember, it's not about us. Even if we've got a teams first approach, in the example that I used where we've got information governance and we may have, say, a freedom of information team, we may have a Microsoft team, We may have an information governance Microsoft team, and we may have a number of others. The information governance capability itself will be part of a departmental capability, won't it? So something like I mentioned, mine was actually IT, but it might be a different area in your organisation. We can still use the hubs to actually link together the SharePoint sites that are all related to that department capability. So if you think about your teams are here, your department's up here as a hub, a SharePoint communication site hub, and we are linking all the SharePoint sites that are associated with our Teams First approach into that hub. We can still do both, because I think sometimes people work on the idea that if we're doing Teams First, we can't do hubs. We can still do both, and it works really well. And remember, people sometimes work in different ways. Okay, so we can still use hubs. I think hubs are a bit overrated from an information governance perspective. Contentious. But from a user perspective, I think they're amazing because they give consistent navigation, search. We can search at the top of the hub and it searches all the content, and it gives us good branding. So that whole department can be branded in the same kind of themes and colours. So don't forget that we can do both. And then for each of our sites, we've already decided what our templating looks like. Okay, we've decided on our structures in terms of what columns we want to present. We might have functional specific for certain teams. We might have added columns. We might have added metadata. And we can do that in Microsoft 365 through something called content types. A content type is a way of applying both what column structures we want, what metadata we want to collect, and what we want on the new menu from a templating perspective. So we can have our organizational baseline that everyone must have, so almost like our organizational DNA, but then we can have additional types of metadata collections, templates, and columns through content types for functional spaces. And that's a really good approach as well. Okay, and that is still all records management. I know you want to know about retention policies and labels, but this is all about records management as well, because it's about how the users feel comfortable working within their repository, so their SharePoint site, and what columns they need in order to influence how they are thinking about records are managed within their area of the business, which leads and drives to that kind of good process management. Okay, we can also tweak and think about metadata in those spaces for our purposes. So it's not just about labels and policies when we're thinking about records management. So it doesn't have to be, that's that single, and it shouldn't be complicated. So particularly to start with, if you're still grappling with this, it shouldn't be complicated. And I'm going to explain this slide. This slide was really funny because I try and talk this idea through in training without a diagram. But when you try and put it into an actual diagram, it is a bit weird. So bear with me on this one. When we start to think about our retention policies and our retention label and the label policies that apply them, we want to be thinking of it as an inverted pyramid, as the diagram shows. Now, this is because we want to try and have the most simple solutions that cover the majority of our information, so the bulk of that inverted pyramid. We want to try and be as simple as possible. So policies are the way to go. Okay. There are risks in relation to policies, which we'll talk about. But we actually want to think about wherever we can applying policies to the bulk of our information. And you can see here, I've got two kind of variables down each. Can't think what the side of a triangle is called. One of those. On one side, I've got the value of information. Now, this is where the risk-based decisions come in. Okay, so value can also equal risk. So you've got low risk or high risk information. If we've got low risk information, we want to be trying to use policies because it's very simple to apply those. There's no review. When it's gone, it's gone. No resource impact for a lot of people. Okay. Thinking about low risk information, I know that we can all think about things like OneDrive. We can think about, I've actually got a question about whether we should put retention on OneDrive, but that's just a personal point. We can think about Teams chitty chat. So the chat that we use in Teams, which should be ephemera, they're really good for policies. But have any of you applied policies to your functional content? I'd like to know in the chat. I always think finance is a good way to do policies, because quite often finance can be quite sort of high risk and high value, the documentation as we need it. So things like invoices, but once they're paid and we just need to keep them for like 6 years or whatever your retention schedule says, that they kind of become quite low value then. So we could apply policies to financial information. Nice clear cut-off each financial year if we get our information architecture right, and then gone. We're not reviewing. Low resource, low risk. So policies can be applied to functional, and don't be afraid of thinking about what's your low risk, low value information that could have a policy applied rather than something that potentially needs a review. Okay. On the other side, I have containers. Policies are really good to apply to big bucket containers. So we talked about chitty chat, we talked about OneDrive, potentially email. You can also think about applying policies from a container thought level, if you like, rather than sort of a low risk information value level. As you come down those sides, though, you can see as we're getting into higher value information, we potentially need to use label and label policies. I still say we should try and apply, even for high value information, at the repository level, rather than at the folder level, which is shown here, and at the document level or the content level, because it's too difficult to manage. Okay. So try not to apply things to folder levels, library levels, document levels. Try to apply it at site level where you can, and that's our preferred way to try and use the bulk of our information. And I hope that made sense. If anyone's got any questions on that, happy to talk that through. Retention policies apply rules at a location level, like an entire site or mailbox, and they're ideal for broad compliance coverage. So, for example, retain everything in SharePoint for 7 years. They are best for organisation-wide or department-wide retention. They help with background compliance. The pros of retention policies: they're simple, they're invisible to users, no review. The cons of that: no event triggers, no review process, and deletes automatically when the period ends. You pays your money and you takes your choice, don't we? I'm trying to think what the single was here that I've just said. Ooh, I missed one. I have applied them where I missed a bit. I have applied them where it didn't matter that there was no review. So low risk, low value, as I mentioned, sort of finance documents. Okay. We have got people, so thank you for popping some things in the chat. We've got people that are trying to apply policies to functional and managing at class rather than record level. Amazing. And retention policies on Teams channel posts. I know. Oh, Rosary, let's try and get away from email and let's try and use channels functionally. That's my dream. That's still my electric dream. And somebody's mentioned the challenge of mixing rot and records. Yes, but I think we kind of have to have a bit of a risk-based approach in relation to some of this. So we've just talked about policies, retention labels. They provide us with granular control. So as we've said before, there are basically the opposite of the policies, and we can make sure that we are applying a review. We can use them for triggers for specific event-based reviews, for example, event-based retention, and we can also use them to mark content as a record or a regulatory record. We can get, with the reviews, just an aside, we can get trapped in a cycle of approvals. There is an issue at the moment with Microsoft 365. The number of reviewers per tenant is 200. And what we've found, or somebody's found, and they've brought it to the RMS CAB, is that people, if they forward on the reviews, those review numbers are increasing, and it means that effectively we're going over that 200 barrier, and it's not visible to the centre. So there's some work going on to try and solve that. Retention label policies is how we take the label and we apply it to certain locations or content. It basically takes the words and puts them into action. So this allows consistent retention across functions, and it makes sure that the right labels appear only when they're needed. And we can add more than one label to one policy. So for example, you can publish all the finance labels in one hit so that you're managing it from an organizational but also a functional perspective. Just conscious of time. The additional points, labels and policies is a two-step process, a bit like a dance hall day. Adaptive scopes, which are an E5 feature I mentioned earlier, where we adapt specifically to apply retention depending on certain attributes, and then certain attributes that changed. I used IAO as an example. We've also got the file plan, which I also touched on earlier, which allows us to extract a whole spreadsheet of the labels that we have in the system at the moment. That's an E5 license capability. And we can also import from the file plan. That scares me. I'm going to be honest. I'm a control freak. Importing labels through the file plan does scare me. Exporting, fine. Right. I'm just going to talk about, before we finish off, layering retention tools. People have mentioned different capabilities in the chat. So I like to think about it. I always think in pictures. Yeah, you all say. Well, let me explain. So I think about layering vertically, which is around containers. So applying retention to my containers. And I've mentioned applying retention to sites, so site level. I also want to apply retention to capability, as we've talked about earlier, like chitty chat. Now, what we can do is we can use the tools that are in Microsoft 365 to actually also do a bit of a horizontal sweep across our organizational tenant for specific higher risk information. So we can use sensitive information types and we can actually go and find those sensitive information types and apply a retention horizontally, if you like, across the different containers in our organization. So you can see here, we've got our vertical containers and then we've got horizontal sensitive information types retention coming across that. We can also do that with keyword query. So keyword query is another automated tool, E5, that allows us to look for certain names, references, clauses, and then we can apply retention to those. So we could use that in the same way. But it's all around testing that to make sure it's picking up the right information. We can also go all the way and create our own sensitive information types or trainable classifiers, but that is very resource intensive. So what we're doing there is we're creating a sensitive information type that is relevant to our organization. We're testing it, and then we're applying a retention to that. Trainable classifiers applies more to a genre of material, for want of a better word. So you could create a trainable classifiers on certain types of information in your organization. There are some embedded by Microsoft, things like legal documents, procurement documents, etc. But this is what we would want to use for the very bottom of our inverted triangle. It's for our really high risk, high value information that we want to label at content level. Okay, so think about only using those when all else has failed, because they're very resource intensive and you need to keep managing and monitoring them. So best practice summary, or please, Louise, did you say that when you were little? Design your information architecture before you deploy retention. Start broad, start with policies and refine with detailed labels later. Use automation to pick up pan-tenant material that is more of higher risk or medium risk. Minimize user tagging and manual processes. Review and audit. And also embed training and change management. Now, questions. Apologies, I haven't got as much time for questions as I'd hoped, but they are all the singles that I couldn't think of a way to wangle into my presentation. The recording will be available, is the last question, I think. Elizabeth, I'm going to start to have a quick peek through the chat. Are there any questions that you've seen, and can you give me the time if you have?
I haven't actually seen any apart from the one that you picked up about retention triggers. There's just been a conversation going on between people about how long they would get before their emails automatically delete. Which, yes, I think we'd have a riot if it was 1 year, to be fair.
Yeah.
Someone's just asked, are you able to repost the link you mentioned? Because, of course, it's now right at the top of the chat.
Of course I can. Of course I can. So I've got the IRMS link, which is there, which is the Teams. That's when we were on the old platform, Elizabeth, and you couldn't put a background on, and I didn't know before I turned up. So that was a funny old day. And there was another link I mentioned, which was about products. I'm not seeing it in the chat. Oh, yes, I am. There we go. Product terms. That was about the licensing. Licensing is a minefield. Try to really read those through before you think about any tiered licensing. What do I think about AI in records management, as in auto-applying policies? Oh, what do I think about that, Leon? I think most organizations just aren't ready. I think from my perspective, I also think that most organizations, the information architecture isn't ready. So it's going to still be really difficult to do that from an AI perspective, potentially, in terms of directing the AI tooling. Is anybody using AI or testing AI for records management at the minute? Anybody? Thumbs up if you are. Oh, Matt is. Yay. That's really interesting. I'd really like to understand how you're testing it, Matt. So maybe we can have an offline conversation at some point. Yeah, I think, and again, Elizabeth and I were talking about this before, I think some people are in marathon space, so they're running off, and it sounds like, Matt, you're in that great space. I think some people are still learning to walk with architecture, retention, remediating, COVID rollout still. We've got all that happening. And somebody's saying, is applying retention to locations and formats methodologically wrong? I nearly said that word. Retention should be applied according to the subject of. Do you know what? In a purist world, Agnes, yes, it is. But if you want to keep your sanity while applying retention and records management to Microsoft 365 and getting it to work and not having lots of reviews to do, I think the best way to do it is through container level. And I still would hang my hat on that. There will be people that are purists that will disagree with me, but I think we have to think about the fact that Microsoft 365 is user focused. Whatever we put in place has to be of benefit to the people using the system. What we need to try and do is make sure we can get the governance in. So we're always balancing that usability with the governance. So I think in an ideal world, yes, but we have to compromise. And Jamie said that exact word, it's a compromise. So, and actually, I'm going to come back to that because actually, I don't wholeheartedly agree with that. Because if you get the information architecture based on business classification, you're actually applying retention to activity function level or activity level at worst. So really, are we in such a bad space if we're applying it? Depends how you've created your containers. And people are saying that they turned off MS Teams, created a rat's nest. I like that, Steve. We could have had Boomtown Rats, but I didn't use the name of the band. I used the name of the song. AI, as Matt's saying, is not a silver bullet. Yeah, we've got that whole garbage in, garbage out issue. There's a really fascinating article today in BBC Scotland about rot as well, and data centres and the amount of water, if anyone's interested. Thank you so much for listening.